Welcome, everybody. This is the Florida Redevelopment Association monthly webinar entitled Summary of 2016 Legislative Session, but we're also mostly focusing on the 2017 session because that's what you really want to know about, right? My name is Carol Westmoreland. I'm the Executive Director of the FRA. We have in attendance Jan Pyland, who's running this webinar and has set it up for us. She is the Executive Assistant at the Florida Redevelopment Association. Want to remind you that this presentation will be posted at www.redevelopment.net after this webinar. If you are not a member of the association, please email me and I will send you a copy. And that is cwestmoreland@flcities.com. We also have as a speaker today John Wayne Smith with Peebles & Smith, LLC. His office is a few floors above us in the fantastic tree-devastated city of Tallahassee. We're digging out from that minor hurricane. And John Wayne has been lobbying for how many years?
26.
26. I think that's a lot of time. We also have David Cruz, who is a lobbyist and a Deputy General Counsel for the Florida League of Cities. He is joining us as well. So after the presentation, John and David are going to be able to answer questions. And if we could hold please send your email questions in as we go along, and then we're going to wait till after the presentation to address those email questions. And the email questions can be you look at the top right-hand box, you can see the way that you can enter those email questions. It's a drop-down dialog box. All right, so John, I'm going to toss it to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Carol. And we can move to the next slide. I'm going to kind of outline what we want to try to accomplish in the next hour or so. These are my targets. My name is John Wayne. I work with one of your other lobbyists, Bill Peoples. And as Carol also mentioned, David Cruz with the League of Cities is here to offer any perspectives and to help with the Q&A. I'm going to try to go through some of the key legislation. There are 4 bills that I just wanted to go over that folks may remember came up in 2016. Talk a little bit about economic development in general and how those issues play into, from a philosophical and an ideological way, some of the CRA and the economic development issues. Try to paint a little bit of the big picture, and then let's talk a little bit about what that means for 2017. We have some unknowns with some of the elections, but trying to give you something to think about for the upcoming year and getting your interest exercise is part of what we want to do. And then when we go through those slides, then we'll do some Q&A for any of the questions that you may have. So let's go to the first slide and talk about House Bill 569. This particular issue has been around for the last 3 or 4 years. The previous years, it's been a little bit more egregious in that some of the folks who have represented some of the public hospitals have wanted an exemption from the CRAs and in particular the TIF funding. This past year, Spagno and Senator Huckel basically wanted a softer approach. They were offering legislation that would basically make this type of exemption a prospective exemption only. So after some discussion with the sponsors, sitting down with some of the FRA leadership, sitting down with the League of Cities, there was a gentleman's agreement to say we would not oppose as long as it was a prospective application. So this one particular bill, 569, was passed and signed by the governor, and so for future CRAs or expansions, if there's an impact on some of the public hospitals, that we can anticipate that those will be exempt from the TIF financing. So that's issue number 1. Go to issue number 2. Next slide. New issue. This one was kind of eventful. Representative Gates, who chaired the Finance and Tax Committee, and in the House tax package included a provision that really wasn't a tax reform or a tax cut provision, but it introduced the idea of requiring CRAs to expend funds in a certain manner. The concept that was introduced in this particular case was youth centers, and what they were basically trying to do is to set up a minimum funding or a revenue stream for the construction and operation of certain CRAs that were going to meet certain criteria. As we found out later in the process, there was one in particular that was creating this effort. You may have even seen some of the newspaper articles that were written. I think most of the media attention occurred after session, but there were some of these centers that were in Miami-Dade County in particular that were creating this. So we did a lot of educating with the House Economic Development Chairman, Representative Oliva, who took a different perspective from Chairman Gates and F&T. And through that education process, we were kind of able to help him understand why this issue didn't fit in a tax package and why it was probably bad public policy for the legislature to start requiring or stating what should be the expenditure priorities for CRAs. This exercise went all the way to the last week of session when we finally saw an amendment that was strictly a target at one particular CRA in Miami-Dade County for a very specific youth center. We were able to keep that language out, but then the bill as itself, the tax reform package, ended up in passing and it was signed, but it did not have any of the bad CRA language in it. So that was a victory and one that had to kind of go all the way into the 2-minute drill or inside the red zone, so to speak, all the way to the end of session. So let's talk about the third issue. Next slide is House Bill 1361. And we had two of these issues where folks were looking at, for various reasons, some expansion targeting the county level. This particular issue showed up in what we call the growth management packages, which were basically a hodgepodge of different growth management issues cobbled together. Representative La Rosa had the House version, and Senator Diaz de la Portilla had the Senate version. And it was kind of just a broad authority allowing counties for various, not any really particular service function, but allowing counties to create TIF districts. But the weird part was that it could even be outside of certain boundaries or inside of existing municipal boundaries and existing CRAs. So the language ended up kind of out at the end of the growth management bills. I think the issue created a lot of confusion, and one of the things that we had pointed out is they did not address how you would approve them, how you would deal with situations if you were going to overlay a new CRA on top of an existing CRA and one that might already have dedicated TIF funds. Not real sure if this one's going to come back or not. It didn't look like it had been well thought out, but I do think that the next issue that we talk about, which are the TRZs, may come back, and it shares some similarities. So let's go to the next issue, the next slide, which are the TRZs, or the Transportation Reinvestment Zones. Similar concept in allowing a county to create a broad CRA or a TIF type model, not using the CRA language, but using this new language that was introduced, which is the TRZs. And it was an interesting concept, and one that folks might want to be able to think about long term, because it was focusing in on transportation related, particularly mass transit infrastructure issues. And we expect, because of other transportation related issues that are out there, and watching what is happening in DC with some of these pilot projects that are out there looking for alternative ways of funding transportation, that someone might take another look at this kind of a model. Again, the legislation didn't pass because the concept wasn't well thought out. It did not address, existing TIFs, and it didn't address some of the interlocal jurisdictional issues. But because it was focused on mass transit in particular, we think that there may be some levels of interest that type of a concept might come back. People are looking for different ways to fund projects, and the concept of TIF seems to be attractive to some of the policymakers. Again, it didn't pass, but that's going to be on our list when we talk about 2017. So those were the first 4 issues. Carol's raising her hand. She wants to break the rules early.
Teacher, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
John's being, and I think David are very humble, but they had a big part in saving off some of these horrible things that could have passed. And I lost a lot of Z's about this transportation reinvestment zones.
Yeah.
It was crazy, the first or second draft, and it was, like you said, not well thought out. It was sponsored, I think, primarily by Miami-Dade County, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Big push down.
Yeah, and like Miami-Dade, there are many counties in the state, many areas that are desperate to have transportation funding. And our position remains that they're confusing their solutions with their funding mechanisms, because redevelopment TIF funding is meant for appreciated value in the property of a particular area. So we basically feel like they're hunting around for some funding mechanism, and they latched on to tax increment financing. That may not be the best way to do it, but thank you, both of you, for bird dog and all that. And the interesting thing about that bill, in the final form, I believe, that did not pass, they still had it no mention that you had to account for where you spent the TIF money, that it had to be allocated for the project to be completed within 3 years. That was never in their language. So they cleverly found that the 3-year limitation, which we'll talk about later, should not be in their version. But this is an issue that counties have been picking on cities about, very ironic. And so hopefully we can use that in the future to try to say, look, everybody knows this 3-year is a problem.
Yeah. Good points. Thanks. So we'll go, I want to talk just a little bit about economic development in general. We'll go to the next slide. For folks who are in either the redevelopment or the economic development world, it was hard not to catch some of the drama that was going on in a big picture way with the state's economic development agencies and entities and the funding that they relied on. Before the legislative session started, the governor had basically 2 priorities. One was tax reform, and the other was making a big push on economic development. He put $250 million on the table. The Senate made every effort that they could to try to reach that goal, because they were not going to probably reach the goal on the tax side. But the House took a very different position, and I mention this because a couple of years back, when we were going through some of the enterprise zone sunset issues and some of the other new leadership in the House that were beginning to evaluate and look at economic development in a new way, we're taking a very different approach. And in a philosophical way, it's one of the reasons why enterprise zones was allowed to sunset and go away. And then in a head-on collision and debate with the governor and the Senate, show just how strong and how consistent they are on some of these issues, because at the end of the day, the House wins and the governor basically got nothing. I'm also on this slide just pointing out one other small target clue that is something we need to be thinking about for 2017. But in the Senate position, they put on the table the use of the state's BP economic revenue loss claim as a funding mechanism for economic development on a statewide basis. And so we're going to come back to that, but I wanted to make note that that is on the slide, and it's something for future discussion, because the House in another discussion basically punted and said we're not going to spend any of that money in the 2016-17 budget. So we'll come back and talk about that. So let's go to the next slide and just talk about some of the big picture issues that were out there. Economic development was part of that discussion. And I mentioned the governor's tax cuts, which was also a big picture issue and one of his major proposals last year. He did not get everything he wanted in that either. He got a smaller package. The three other issues that had the biggest interplay with the bigger budget and fiscal decisions was education infrastructure. And I mentioned that because in part the 2015 vetoes helped create a backlog, and for the first time in a very long time, the House, the Senate, and the governor agreed to use bonding in their budget, which they had not done in a while. The other two issues, which are kind of a little bit interrelated, is water policy passed, an exercise that took 4 years, and then also the state was able to make an annual commitment to the Everglades and dealing with some of those issues. They called it the Legacy Act. It's important because they've dedicated $200 million annually over the next 18 years for Everglades, and I make a note of that because I think that there's going to be a part 2 when we start talking about 2017. So let's go and start thinking about 2017. I think that's our last slide, and then we can do some of the Q&A. So it's kind of strange and unique at this point. We really don't know at this point kind of what the governor's going to care about, primarily because of what happened to his proposals last year. I'm not sure at this point where he wants to use his bandwidth, and we find it interesting and important because we also believe that the governor has an interest in Senate statewide elections in the coming years. So looking at 2018 and the things that are out there and watching what he wants to do is very important, but he's got a House leadership that doesn't really want to play on the same page or in the same swim lane that he's in. So I mentioned that because in the near future we hope to kind of see where he wants to exercise some of his political capital. The other thing that I want to mention that is out there that is going to be a major discussion is what to do with the state's $2 billion from the economic claim from the BP settlement. And that money is going to come in over time, but this summer they got their first round of funding, which was $400 million, and they will get another round of money that they can spend in next year's budget if they'd like to. It's going to be interesting to see if that's used for environmental stuff or if somebody tries to wedge some of the economic development issues back in. The other thing that I want to mention, and you watch how leadership begins to kind of plant some of their flags for what they care about. On the Senate side, Senator Negron's kind of come out real early and indicated what he cares about. Before we've even begun the budget, he spent about $3 billion. He said what he wants to do with state university system. Senator Negron has been directly impacted by some of the things that are happening in the Everglades, particularly with some of the fallout on the east and west distribution of water. There are also South Florida issues with the Florida Bay that are impacted by how they handle the plumbing inside the Everglades. And then another unique thing that has happened of late is Senator Latvala has kind of put a flag in the ground on professional sports, which is an issue the House has kind of thwarted the last couple of years. Senator Latvala is going to want to care about the baseball team in St. Pete, and some of the House that have blocked some of these attempts would lead me to believe that perhaps some of these economic development fights might reoccur, but with new players, and maybe some of the senators won't take a knee as easy as they have in the past. So that's something that we're kind of waiting to see kind of how that develops. On the House side, they haven't really been as outspoken as what they care about, but what we have seen and what have been some small media articles have been on the FRS, that they bring back some of those issues that they were unsuccessful in dealing with in the governor's first round. They'll probably put tax cuts on the something that CRAs and local governments may want to pay attention to down the road is the commercial property cap assessment that's currently in the Constitution is scheduled to sunset in a few years. There's already talk among some of the business interests that they don't want to wait for that sunset to create their deadline. So we're anticipating that 10% cap issue to probably be introduced in 2017. And if you recall, the last time we had this exercise, we wrestled with the realtors over a 5% cap, which the league and the counties and other local government institutions all opposed when it was on the ballot a few years back. So that is a potential issue that I think local governments and anyone that relies on property tax revenue is going to have to probably care about. And then I just mentioned that the elections are still out there because of what the courts have done. There's still a whole bunch of unknowns. There's going to be a lot of more competitive races, and so how things play out through November, there's still a calculus that folks are trying to kind of figure out to see if there's going to be more moderation or some shifting of power with some of these elections that are still outstanding. So those are the items that I wanted to kind of run through and go over. I think at this point, Jan or someone's going to kind of give me a clue as to what questions, if we have picked on anything and got you thinking, and y'all have sent any questions or in. We've also got David here to share some of the league's perspectives and if they're hearing anything different. So I'm going to take a stop and pause and see what questions we have.
Thank you so much, John. That was excellent. Obviously, follow the money. That, you know, our sessions are becoming much more focused on revenues and how to spend them and who's going to spend them now that the economy's come back. Interesting. I did want to ask David Cruz with the Florida League of Cities to comment. He's very involved in the constitutional revision process, and if you would just give him a framework and what exactly we can expect in the next year.
Thanks, Carol. Absolutely. I'll be happy to. One of the things that's been on our minds and many of the players in Tallahassee for this upcoming session and the following year is the Constitutional Revision Commission process. And if you're not familiar with that process, it's actually one of the 5 ways that we could amend Florida's Constitution. It only happens once every 20 years, so this will only be the 3rd time in Florida's history that we will have the CRC meeting. And the CRC is actually appointed. The governor, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the Attorney General get appointments, and they go ahead and pick anybody to sit on this commission, and they can go ahead and do anything to Florida's Constitution, from writing a new Constitution to coming up with ideas to amend the Constitution. Ultimately, those ideas are then going to be vetted by Florida's voters on the 2018 general election, and they would require a 60% voter approval in order to pass. What ideas the CRC thinks about, how those appointments are made, will probably come into play during the 2017 session. We will actually know who's going to be sitting on the CRC by February of 2017, so that'll be right before this upcoming legislative session starts. So that's something just to keep on the back of your minds, and it's certainly something that might affect how redevelopment and economic development in the state of Florida is done if some proposals are taken up by the CRC.
Is pot, the legalization of medical marijuana, one of those things, or is it on the ballot?
Well, there's currently a constitutional amendment that a ballot initiative that will be on the general election for 2017. So that's something that might come up
Oh, I see.
already on its own
Right.
without the CRC looking at it further.
Okay, so they have both avenues, and if other initiatives come up, like we have an exemption right now for historic properties on taxation. We have an economic development exemption under Section 197. Those things could be revamped, and if they do look at it in whole, they could either take them away or add to them, and that as well would be something that redevelopment interests should watch.
Absolutely, yeah. I would keep a very close eye on the CRC process. If you're not familiar with it, in the past what they've done is they've held meetings around the state and taken public input and comments. So if they have a CRC meeting close to your city, I would definitely suggest trying to sit in on those CRC meetings and go ahead and give public input if they're considering amendments that revamp economic development or redevelopment in the state of Florida.
Yeah, and with the emphasis on the legislative process of economic development, it wouldn't be surprising. So everybody who works in redevelopment should stay very closely coordinated with city and county governments, since this would impact them as well as CRAs and other redevelopment interests, private sector. Very important issue. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a couple questions that I thought I would address. And one is the hospital exemption issue that we talked about. Any hospitals that are public hospitals, and by that means they levy ad valorem taxes.
Yeah.
So this does not affect private hospitals. They are only exempt from paying into CRA trust funds if the CRA is new past 2016.
Yeah, it's prospective.
Prospective. So the compromise was in the vein of you're not missing the money because you never did get the money. And we realize it is a loss in revenues for CRAs, but the wrangling and the gnashing of the teeth and the wailing about how unfair it was that hospitals who were public hospitals relying on taxpayer dollars had to give in to these development agencies was really hurting our image, if you will, before the legislature. So sometimes you have to let off the steam of the pressure cooker in order to calm the situation down, and that's what we basically did.
Can I add just a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in one of the things from a strategic standpoint that maybe some folks don't understand, but there was an internal and with different folks with the league and with the FRA to discuss letting that go through. The way it turned out, and we did know that we were going to have some other issues, but because Senator Huckel from Volusia County was involved in that discussion, we made her happy. It gave us a lot of political bandwidth to kill and to knock down some of these other bad concepts that were out there. She really went to bat for us on this mandatory expenditure issue and some of these other county-related type TIF concepts that were thrown out there. So she comes from a municipal background. She understands TIF. She understands CRAs. She kind of asked us in as polite of way, if we do this in this most narrow way, will you still be my friend? Will you allow this to go? And we took a knee and did that. And but doing that, we really gained a friend because she was the chair in the F&T committee on the Senate side. And so when everything bad kept coming up later during the session, she was there with a gigantic hammer and helped smack down a lot of this other bad stuff that kept popping up. So that's just internal politics and letting you know how some of these issues kind of fit together. But I think it's important that you understand that Senator Huckel came forward and was a big part of our success in some of those other issues.
Just to echo what John said, Senator Huckel was definitely our champion on the youth center issue that came up. She was definitely very vocal and adamant in opposing any mandatory funding going towards youth centers from CRA funds. And so while she didn't necessarily help us with the hospital district bill, she was definitely there to help us on the other fights that we had on the Senate side.
Thank you both. I've got another question, and inquiring minds want to know, are there any ongoing local or regional CRA issues that one party or another might bring to the legislature to try to solve local problems through the legislative process? And what is it that Bill Peoples always says? Put out your fires locally. Don't bring them to the legislature, because once it hits the legislative fan, you have 140, 160 in the House,
120 in the House,
120 in the House, 140 in the Senate.
Yeah.
People who have no real, if you will, interest in resolving the issue, and it becomes a political trading point or a chit. And so for that reason, we don't know of anything except maybe the Miami-Dade grand jury report that might be coming to the legislative process this year.
Yeah.
I'm going to let John Wayne and David talk about that, because we have gotten an inquiry from the House. Is it?
You got calls from Teddy and Pam, didn't you?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and it was interesting because last year, all of the educational work that we had to do with the various issues that popped up, we really made Representative Oliva, who was the chairman on the economic development side, we made him a quasi-expert of CRAs and TIF. In a good way, you know, he's going to probably be the speaker in 3 years, so it's nice to have him prepped and educated on a lot of these issues. But in doing so, I think we jotted his brain a little bit, so I think that there are some questions and some things that he's had staff reach out to educate. And as a member from Miami-Dade, where there seems to be a lot of these just different, unique, specific issues that are popping up, he's cared from a constituency standpoint as well. So we continue to try to work with him and make him feel like he gets all the information that he needs. The one thing that I will mention that I don't know if Carol, we've talked about in an indirect way is I know many people in the CRA community and the board has even had some discussions with CRA discussion on the 3-year provision of having to expend all the funds to avoid having to have some allocation back to the entities where it comes from. So one of the things that Bill and I will attempt to do, and we'll have definitely time to do that this fall, is in determining, you know, are there going to be specific issues or a level of interest to look at CRAs in a more general way. But that is an issue that FRA has kind of had in their back pocket to say, you know, it would really be nice at some point in the future if we could fix that particular issue, because I think it has created some planning issues as well as some budgetary issues. So knowing when we could feather that arrow and take a shot at that is something that I think people should just kind of keep in the back of their mind, because I think there is some value if we got the opportunity to try to fix that issue at some point in the future.
Thank you, John. And for those of you who are new to this issue, under Chapter 163, Part 3, 163.387.3.2, I believe, or 3.3.
Playing lawyer.
I don't know. I'm yes, and it is there, and it's under the funding of redevelopment plans, and it says that you've got to allocate and essentially direct funds at the end of the fiscal year into one of 4 different categories. The issue is you can return it to the county or the city. You can, to my knowledge, this has never been done. You can allocate it to debt. You can allocate it to escrow for future debt, or you can allocate it to a redevelopment project, and the words are to be completed within 3 years. Well, this is prove to be a challenge because 3 years doesn't always provide the best time frame. You may be under that, you may be over that. And auditors as well as county governments have asked the question, what does this mean? So interpretation aside, it is very unclear. There's no enforcement penalty. And because of that, we've had nothing but wrangling over the meaning of those words. In fact, there is a case that is pending in Pompano Beach with the county of Broward over this issue. So this is something that we hope that the counties come forward and say, you know what, this is unreasonable. We agree with you. We don't need to come down like a hammer on you over these kind of things, and that we could work it out. We have several different versions of some options that we might be able to pursue. If anybody has had experience with this, let me know locally. Here's another question. Would the transportation zone legislation, would that as filed have preempted an existing CRA TIF, and was there a boundary overlap?
The answer to the overlap would be yes. The way that the language was drafted, it was very unclear. So we were assuming that the answer to the first question might be yes as well. So because it was not well thought out, because it wasn't written well, those unanswered questions we had to assume could be problematic for existing CRAs. So that's one of the reasons why it did not pass, because of that uncertainty and the clarity was so poor.
Okay, another question. Is there someone from the Florida Redevelopment Association or the Florida League of Cities seeking a gubernatorial appointment to the CRC?
The answer to that is yes.
David, are you the guy?
Sure. I guess for CRC, the Florida League of Cities is definitely considering it. That's actually a discussion that the League of Cities board will be having at the end of this month. But we are definitely coming up with a CRC plan and strategy, and we will be diligently working, if not to get an appointment, to influence the decision-making of the CRC and what constitutional amendments they contemplate on working on.
Thank you. Another question. In the archives, whatever happened with the governor's review of special districts, and did they actually review CRAs? Well, the answer to that is the governor's review of special districts was a big issue when he first took office the first time. There was some confusion recorded in the Palm Beach Post that these special districts were not as accountable as they would like, and the governor responded and said, I'll do some studies on these special districts. The first one was, I believe, the mosquito control districts. That study was completed. It was a biting report. I'm sorry. And the second one was the fire districts, fire control districts, and then nothing else happened. There was some talk about making, if you will, a new list of things to do and things to report for all special districts, but I believe that that morphed into a revision of the special districts law 2 years ago when there was a major overhaul, so to speak. And in my humble opinion, special districts are now more transparent, required to be more transparent and more accountable in their record keeping than almost any other government. So CRAs are in that net. They are forever special districts, dependent special districts. So whatever gets done for them gets done for us in the legislature. So far, those changes have been fairly positive, fairly minimal in impact, although CRAs have had to make adjustments like website listings and budget resolutions and all that kind of thing. There's a lot more information on all that under my FRA resources and redevelopment agencies. We have the webinar on end-of-year reporting compliance and also budgeting processes at the end of the year. So do refer to that. I do have another question, guys, and that is, what do you think now, just a general tutorial, after the election, you have 1 year, at least in the House, where folks do not have to, quote, run. What do you think? How does that frame, or how does that set the stage for what actually is a priority? I mean, in my experience, if there's not an election year, folks have a mentality of, well, we'll talk about it 1 year and then we'll leave it for next year to resolve. That's a little more common of a philosophy. And there's not as much of an urgency maybe to get things passed, to get on the road and say, look what we did for you. But with the economic development actually being really active last year, do you think they'll get more or less serious about passing something? Or do you think it'll be a 2-year cycle? Any way to know?
Well, I think you have to look at who has their hands on the wheel. I think that tells us more than the traditional cycles. And the things that I read on the House side is that the current House leadership for the next 2 and probably next 4 years are not going to be proactive agendas. You're looking at 2 individuals that are, in a conservative way, not going to be putting, major reforms out on the table or trying to change a lot. They tend to be the type to do less is better. So the thing that's going to be the most interesting, I think, because of this cycle on the House side, if you combine knowing where the leadership comes from, is with a substantial amount of new House members, there's a substantial amount of training and education and mentoring that also has to go on before, things are able to be accomplished, and for those members to actually have any real input or make any kind of things cool happen. So I'm looking at, particularly on the House side, an extremely limited agenda, which in contrast to the Senate may create some issues, because we have a lot of people from the House who are jumping to the Senate who may have been in a position for a long time of not being able to do much, who are now for the first time going to be able to flex a little bit. So, knowing what those things are going to all be, I think it's probably a little early. I highlighted what I think are some of the bigger issues that could come up. I do think economic development issues do come back in some way. What I don't know is, with the new leadership, are those relationships strong enough between the governor and the Senate that it would be a team approach, or would it be some awkward, we both agree kind of a thing? So we still have a lot to learn because the elections haven't happened, but my anticipation on the House side is that less is good over there based on their leadership.
Thank you. And then as a follow-up, each of you, if you don't mind, what can FRA members do now to help the organization survive another session and even do better than that, but make some good changes? What should they be doing? David, I'll start with you right now, because if you wait till session, it's too late, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now, during the interim, is the best time to either foster your relationships with your local elected representative and state senator. You should be definitely trying to get them to attend your city commission meetings, to attend your CRA board meetings, also trying to get them out to do CRA tours and show them all the positive work that the CRAs are doing locally, so that when they come to Tallahassee and they're presented with a CRA bill, that it's not the first time they're learning about what CRAs do, what TIF financing is, and that they have absolutely no idea what's going on, and they just vote how they're told to vote rather than knowing what kind of impact that vote has back home locally. So now's the time to try to inform them, to get them educated on these issues so that when they come to Tallahassee during the legislative session and everything's moving at a very quick pace, that they know what CRAs do and they're able to vote with a little bit of knowledge.
You know, John?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think CRAs are unique in that they have a story to tell. They have projects to show. So I would emphasize from what David said is to, utilize the new projects or showing off the projects that you've been doing with some of these new members that are going to be coming in. I think we're have a small advantage. I won't say it's a great advantage, but I do think we have some small advantage that with the term limits, we do have a growing number of local government, particularly city people, that are moving into state policy-making roles. But we shouldn't assume that all of these folks know the individual stories. They may know the story of the local government that they were serving under, but if they've assumed a larger footprint or a larger boundary for their election process, reach out to them and make sure that if you're a neighboring city or a city a couple of cities away, bring them in and invite them to see kind of the cool stuff that you've been doing and make sure that they know, how you finance those and are aware of those. There are going to be some that won't have any experience in government, and they certainly get tremendous educational benefit from knowing those things. But to me, it's the touching, seeing, feeling, and smelling that helps more than inviting them to a meeting. If they get to see something cool, that is a picture that they can have forever. So show them the actual projects and let them see it, and then show them a picture of what it used to look like, that kind of a thing.
All right. Well, seeing no other business, I would like to put in a shameless plug for the annual FRA conference in Orlando, because on October 12th through 14, a lot of people around the state that deal with redevelopment, community redevelopment agencies, and incentive programs, programs that economic development touches on redevelopment and is an important funding source, main streets that use CRA funding to get their projects and plans going. CRAs, everything CRAs will be at the Orlando Hilton on I-Drive, October 12th through 14, 2016. And our famous lobbyists, John Wayne and Bill Peebles, David Cruz maybe, will be back to let you have another update on what exactly is happening, because that'll be about a month away and things happen very quickly. So we will have another legislative update at the conference. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And like I said, if you have any questions or need a copy of this presentation, it's cwestmoreland, 3 words put together, at flcities.com. Thank you very much.